Good afternoon. John Dunstable was a musician and composer and a keyboard player from the 14th century England. He lived somewhere around born between 1380 and 90 and lived until 1843. And this particular piece is called the Agincourt hymn because it had to do with the Battle of Agincourt. And there are words that go with it about thanks be to God that England rode forth victoriously. Our king went forth to Normandy with grace and might and chivalry. There God for him wrought marvelously, where England may be called and cry, Deo gratias, Anglia red pro victoria. So thanks be to God, England rode forth victoriously. Well, having to do with an ancient battle, that's the way we're starting today. Although the first composer that I'm going to discuss today is actually much older than that. We're going back to the 8th century, in the Middle Ages, and to talk about a couple of hymns. I'm going to describe basically 3 hymns with a little fourth at the end. The first one has to do with Palm Sunday, the second one has to do with Good Friday, and the third one has to do with Easter, with one tagged on at the end. So this first hymn that we're going to discuss is All Glory, Laud, and Honor, which was translated into English by an Anglican clergyman in the 19th century. I'll talk about him in a minute. But the hymn was a Latin hymn. But first of all, what is a hymn? Well, a hymn is a piece of music which is a setting of a poem or a devotional thought that's dedicated to the praise of God with a capital G, or gods with small g's, or some person or event. It's honoring something. The word paean is frequently substituted for it, which means something in praise of someone or something. So hymns actually have quite a long history, going way back into antiquity, and then their association with the Christian church actually comes in around the 5th and 6th century that we have written records of things. And there were hymns that were described as being monophonic. That means they had one melodic line. Later, some that were polyphonic. They had more than one line, multiple lines. And then eventually, around the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 15th century, we start to hear hymns that are written in many parts, multiple parts, that are sung congregationally. And this was a whole new event. And so that in itself has a very colorful and interesting history, starting with the time of Martin Luther coming forward. Today, hymns are just thought to be something that's in a blue book that's in the pew. But it has quite a wonderful history that is much more unusual than that and much more singular, depending on where you live in the world and in the culture in which you're raised. This hymn, All Glory, Laud, and Honor, was first written in Latin as Gloria Laus et Honor, and it was sung to what tune we're not sure. It became associated with another tune much, much later, the tune that we know now. But the words were written by a fellow with a wonderful name, Theodulf of Orléans, France, which is the same town from which we find Jeanne d'Arc. The Joan of Arc came from that town a couple hundred years later. He was born around 1750 or 60 and lived until 1821. He was a writer and a poet, and he was born in Spain, and he was of Visigoth ancestry. And he fled Spain because of the Moorish occupation, which was not very comfortable for him and for many of the people there. And he traveled extensively throughout the area of Gaul, that is southern Spain and France, and he went to a monastery where he was in southern Gaul, in Aquitaine, where he was educated. His education was quite fine, and the way of being educated at that point was drastically different from what we know today, but you basically studied with a scholar, with a tutor, one-on-one, or with a couple of people working with a tutor, and he studied with various ones in various places. In around 1786, he made a trip to Rome, and one of the things that really caught his attention was the fact that there were many established schools of education for young people, predominantly for boys and men. And he wrote letters to the people back in his country, in the Frankish area, encouraging abbots, heads of monasteries, various people, to establish some school systems and public schools for educating. This was all during the time of the reign of Charlemagne, one of the great rulers of history. And Charlemagne recognized that Theodulf was quite an unusual person and would be a great attraction in his court. So he asked him to come to his court, and he made him the Bishop of Orleans in 798, and also the abbot of several monasteries, including one, a Benedictine abbey at Fleury-sur-Loire. Then, having that power behind him, Theodulf established quite a few schools, public schools, in areas around monasteries, and he oversaw them and their work. When Charlemagne died in 1814, he was succeeded by his son, Louis the Pious. And Louis had a nephew who was the king of Italy, which had to profess allegiance to France. And King Bernard of Italy decided that he wanted independence of the Frankish Empire, and he raised an army against them. And he was talked into surrendering, but he was punished by Louis in a very terrible way, who would sentence him to have his eyesight destroyed, removed. The whole operation went very bad, and Bernard died as a result of this. One of the other persons who was caught up in this and was designated as a person who was supportive of Bernard was Theodulf. So as a result of that, Louis banished him to an island, in a monastery in Angers. And he spent the next couple of years there. He was finally released from there, and he tried to reclaim his bishopric in Orleans, but he was never able to reach the city. He died en route. Now we're going to see a picture of Theodulf right off the press of Kodak in the 800s. And in this, you will see him dressed in a costume that's typical of the clerics and monks. Hospitality was something that was very important to Theodulf, and he thought that it was a responsibility of all people who could afford to do so to help those who were less fortunate. He said, the more effort we put into inviting people to eat at our dinner table, those who are less fortunate, the more likely and the more warmly will we be welcomed at God's banquet table in the next life. There was a beautiful oratory that was built at one of his abbeys, and I think we're going to see a photograph of this one. At Germigny and Germigny-des-Prés, and it was part of a whole structure of the abbey there. And about a century after it was built, the whole thing was destroyed, except for the oratory. An oratory is a chapel that's a church or a chapel that's devoted to prayer. And that was fortunately not destroyed. It was restored in the 19th century again in a kind of overly elaborate way, not so much sympathetic to how sparse it was at that time. But one of the things that fortunately was restored was a mosaic, which we're going to see, or you may be seeing already, and it was a mosaic that depicts the Ark of the Covenant, that you can see the angels standing around the Ark of the Covenant in this mosaic. And it's one of the only mosaics that survived from this time. And the particular subject matter, the Ark of the Covenant as the design for the mosaic, was usually found only in very early Jewish Bibles. And for them, it was usually the only illustration in their Bibles. Well, this music, or rather the words of this hymn, were translated in 1851 by John Mason Neal. His picture will be popping up. And he translated these works into English, and that was the first time that it was being able to be sung in the English language. His translations were rather difficult, so they were frequently amended by publishers. But he said he didn't really mind that. He was just happy to know that the words could be included in the common property of Christendom. He grew up in a rather austere but sincere home that was very evangelical in spirit. However, he was much more inclined toward the Roman Catholic Church. And so he had a series of contrasts in his life. He was ordained in the Anglican Church and years later in 1842. But before that, he was a student at Cambridge University, and he always had a gift for writing poetry. And 16 times, or rather 11 times, he was awarded the Centurion Prize, which was evidently a very coveted prize for scholastic achievement at Cambridge University. After he was ordained, he spent most of his time working as the warden of the Sackville College in East Grinstead, which was a retirement home for poor men. And he served them for a long time, and then he expanded the ministry to include indigent women and orphans, so those who were very poor and had no place to go. He provided a place for them and oversaw that institution. He also founded the Sisterhood of St. Margaret, which became one of the finest nursing orders in England, order for training nurses. Now, the music for this particular hymn that we associate with it today was written by Melchior Teschner, and he lived between 1584 and 1635. It was written first in a manuscript form, and the manuscript is going to appear on your screen. I have a copy of the manuscript in front of me, and this manuscript is one in which you see the notation of that particular time. This is back in the 16th century. The notes looked quite different from what they do today. It was based on a hymn that was actually a funeral hymn. The words were of this hymn that came from that era. And if I let will ich dir geben, then which is saying, I will take a fond farewell of this word. On the manuscript page, the words are written in German, in Old German, but also in Old Script. So it's difficult for our eyes today to really read this unless you spend some time doing it. This is the sound of the hymn as it originated in the 16th century, playing it from the manuscript. sounds pretty much the way we know it today. We have just a few little smoother and melodic lines to it, but it's essentially the same. So I'm going to play it, and as I play this, you're going to see some images of Palm Sunday coming up, some from classic mosaics and artistic works, paintings, and also a contemporary photograph of a Palm Sunday procession. Well, the next hymn that I'm going to discuss is hymn 164 in your hymn book, and the music was written by a very interesting and colorful individual whose name was Peter Abelard. His own life experience was so colorful, it could be the subject of a movie today. It had all kinds of ups and downs and drama in it. And he lived in the early days. He was born in Brittany in 1079. And his life had been organized that he would be going into the military as a profession. He would have been a knight. But he decided at one point that he actually wanted to follow a more scholarly route of life. So he actually had to give up his inheritance and the possibility of a knighthood, and he wanted to study philosophy. He spent a lot of time traveling and studying with different philosophers, and the way of education, again, was one-on-one for the most part. His philosophy and rationale in its philosophy was something that became very influential throughout years that followed. He was celebrated in philosophy itself for his logical solution to the problem of universals via nominalism and conceptualism, and his pioneering of intent in ethics. I'll just say a little bit that the intent of ethics is a very interesting thing because it had to do with morality, and it became a really strong influence on moral law that evolved many, many years later in the entire Western world. He started out after his study by establishing a school of his own, and students came and he worked with them, but he wasn't quite strong enough yet in his training to maintain it, and so he gave that up and he went back to his home in Brittany for several years. Then he returned to Paris and that area somewhere around 1108 to 1113, and his health was stronger and his ambition was stronger. And he worked with a very famous lecturer. He attended the lectures of William of Champeaux. Now there's a picture of him coming up, and you'll see that he is there in the robes of a scholar or a cleric. When he came back to Paris, he became a scholar in residence at Notre Dame. And that was one of the first universities in existence in the Western world. And then in the course of his work there, he became romantically involved with one of his students. It was a woman student, which was unusual for the time, and he has always been a supporter of women's education and of the women having an education and an opportunity in life to use it. His student was Héloïse de Argenteuil, and they fell very much in love. As a cleric, he was not supposed to marry, but they married in secret. And there was a child later, but this was not looked upon favorably by the church at large, and particularly by his uncle Fulbert, who was a canon at the cathedral in Paris. And as a result of that, he forbade the relationship, and Peter sent his wife away to a monastery so that she would be safe from the abusive nature of her uncle. And he, in the meantime, became very abusive, and he had a group of men attack Peter d'Arbelard, and they castrated him. So much for the home life. So I think we're going to see another photograph of Peter Arbelard. And I think in this picture you'll see that he looks kind of grumpy. I think we all know why. But that was one of the most famous elements of his existence. And we're seeing now a photograph of an old mosaic of Peter and Héloïse. That's actually from the cover of a book. And he wrote a great many works and a lot of letters to her. They wrote poetry, and they corresponded for many years together. And much of that correspondence has been recorded. He was censored by the church for his approach, his rationale, and his philosophy and approach to articles of faith. And it was because of that, one of the persons who censured him was a rather famous name in early church history. That's Bernard of Clairvaux. And they objected to Abelard's conclusions as well as his approach to matters of faith. So he was censured and he accepted this gracefully and graciously, and was under this ban for several years. Later, the ban was lifted, and he was able to continue. He'd hoped to continue to teach, but his health deteriorated, and he died in 1142. So his body was interred at an abbey which is called the Paraclete, which was an abbey that he had established many years ago, and which later became a convent. So his students became celebrity people in the society of that time, of the 11th century and the 12th century. There were scholars, there were artists, there were poets, there were several popes who all came from that time. And the music of the hymn that I'm discussing, which is hymn 164, Alone Thou Goest Forth, O Lord, which has to do with Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. The music was written by a fellow by the name of William Tansier. And there's a picture of him coming, which is up on your screen. And he was an English composer and a music teacher. He published a musical grammar, which was used up until the 19th century. So he was from the area of Dunchurch in Warwickshire in England. So this hymn, which had been translated from Latin to English, was set to the music, and this is the music of the hymn. The words by Peter Abelard. I think I skipped one or two photographs that we had available, but there was, if you've seen them all, we're going to move right on to hymn 207, the last hymn I'm going to discuss, which is an Easter hymn, Jesus Christ is Risen Today. And this was a hymn that came from the 14th century and written by, it's not known who wrote it, excuse me. Surrexit Christus hodie. Today Christ is risen. It's based on Matthew, the stories as portrayed in the gospel. And Matthew in Acts and Peter in Revelation. And it's the hymn was perhaps the most famous, most well-known hymn in Christendom for Easter. It was first written on a couple of manuscripts that were found in Munich and in Breslau, and it was later translated into English by a fellow whose name is John Baptist Walsh in the 18th century. And then it had an original first verse, it had two additional verses that were translated. Then the fourth verse that we have today in our hymnals was written by Charles Wesley. It's a doxology, a verse of praise. And Wesley was one of the two brothers who were the founders of Methodism. And this hymn, they were both Anglicans, but the Methodist Church grew out of their work and their preaching. We're going to see a photograph, or a couple of photographs, that come from classic paintings and mosaics. Numbers 15 and 16, as I play the hymn, the Easter hymn, that we will all look forward to singing on Easter Day. Now that hymn has a meter or poetic feet that go to the meter of seconds of 7 stressed syllables in each line. Jesus Christ is risen today with an alleluia. And then the second line is our triumphant holy day. 7 syllables, 7 metric feet rather in each. And then 7 more in the following 2 lines. So if you look at the bottom of the hymn book, you'll see very small print which says in our hymn book that the words are Latin from the 14th century. They were translated and first in a book called the Lyric Davidica, and that was a collection of devotional songs by this John Baptist Walsh in the 1708. The fourth stanza was written by Charles Wesley, 1707 to 1788. All of this information I'm reading from the bottom page of our hymn book. Then it says that the music, the tune, Easter Hymn, from Lyra Davidica of 1708, was adapted from the Complete Psalmist of 1749. And then it has a descant with it. Then in very small print, it finally says 77.77 with alleluias. Those are the metric feet, the poetry of the hymn. There's one other hymn, one that we would sing a couple of weeks later, Ascension Day, which has a very similar feel, and it has the very same structure, 7/7 with alleluias. And that's the hymn that is Hail the Day That Sees Him Rise. And as I play this hymn, you're going to see a couple of more photographs of artwork from the classical composers, artists. The first one is Noel Coypel, is from the 18th century France, and he was mostly known as a painter decorating and doing paintings and decorations for the Louvre and for the Palace of Louis XIV, and in many of the buildings and the galleries around the time. He was a member of the French court. So I will play the hymn. This again has the same feeling of 7 stressed syllables followed by an alleluia for all 4 lines of the piece. Hail the day that sees him rise. Well, that concludes our program today, except for this reminder. This Sunday is Palm Sunday, so I hope you'll be here as part of the procession for Palm Sunday and for the entire experience of Holy Week. And then I want to give a special little punch to Good Friday, in which we will be observing the liturgy of Good Friday and telling the story of the Passion of Christ through wonderful music. The choir, some additional singers are joining us, soloists, our soloists, and a wonderful cellist who plays with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I hope you will join that. To be in person is a great thing. You can experience more by being in person than just watching at home, but I'm glad that you're able to experience this live stream. So please come and experience the journey of Holy Week with us entire week. Thank you. Good night.